So working with patterns in Illustrator, again, can be a handy tool for creating various fills, different types of fills, and also creating tiled backgrounds and tiled patterns, repeating patterns. I'm going to show you relatively quickly first the move tool, which comes in super handy when creating patterns, because you can get really precise movements and transformations instead of just kind of like arbitrarily or even using your smart guides. The smart guides are really nice, but sometimes you need to get like super precise with creating some of these objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the move tool using, just going to take off this stroke. Show you the move tool, creating just kind of like a quick checkerboard. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but you want to make sure that your rulers are showing. If your rulers are not showing, you can do View, and under Rulers, mine are showing, so they're going to automatically say Hide. Or you can just do Command R, and that will show and hide rulers. So Command R. Sort of by default, whenever I open up a new document, whenever I open anybody else's document, pretty much anything, if the rulers aren't showing, just kind of by default, it's the first thing I do is show rulers. Whether I use them or not, I just kind of like having them there. And then you want to make sure that they're in the units that you want. In this case, we want inches. So you can, what I usually do is I just hold Control, and I'll click just right in the ruler, and you can change your increments here. So you can change the points, picas, inches, millimeters, etc. We're going to leave it at inches. You can also change that in the document setup, which is, I think, under File, Document Setup. I honestly find it just easier to hit Control and click on the rulers there. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch red rectangle, and then I'm just going to move it up into this corner here. And then, like I said, with something like this, in this case where I'm showing you, teaching you the move tool, with something like creating a simple pattern like a checkerboard, you can do that Option Shift so it doesn't move, and drag, and kind of do, oops, move it first, there we go. And it's relatively easy to create this checkerboard pattern, changing these to black, for example. And then you can just grab the rest here and then highlight all these, and I'm holding my Option and Shift, oops, holding my Option, moving it, holding Shift to drag them down. And then you can simply rotate or flip these, and you have your checkerboard, right? For something that's super simple like this, using that option to drag to make a copy, in this case, will be super effective. But sometimes, like I said, I'm going to delete all these. Sometimes we want to be really precise and use the move tool. So again, this is going to be kind of super simplified, but you'll get the general idea. What we want to do is in our, why am I blanking? I want to say target, and that's not the right word. We're moving our object from where we have our, I'll zoom in here, where you're selecting where the object moves from. In this case, it's going to move from the top left, or you can have it move from the center. We want to keep this at the top left, or any of the left points in this case. And then we're going to go to Object And under transform, technically a move is a transform. And when we hit move, actually move it to this window. I'm going to hit preview. I always like to hit preview just to see where it's going to go. And you'll see here it went, the last time we did this, it was vertical. So what we're going to do is we're going to move this horizontally a half an inch. I'm going to make that vertically 0 because all we want to do is just move this a half inch, right? As we're moving the whole thing, and we've targeted it to move from, and in this case, any of these left anchor points. Because if we did it from the center, it would only move from like here to here, and you'd have half the square. So in this case, we're going to hit copy instead of OK, so it creates another copy. And now we have our 2 red squares. And then we're going to change this one to black. And then we're going to select these 2. And we're going to go to transform and move again. And in this case, we're going to do it an inch, and we're still targeting that left side. But we want to move this an inch because we're moving both squares together, right? So it's half an inch and half an inch, creating an inch total. And again, we're going to hit copy, and it creates our copy. And in this case now, since we've changed the color, now we can just repeat that transformation, which is super, super handy. So you can do you can do transform as I flip out and move over it, and transform again, and that will repeat whatever the last transformation that you just did, or Command D. So in this case, I'll do Command D for transform again. And then we have our first line of our checkerboard. And then again, we're going to select all of these. We're going to do a transform, and we're going to do a move. And in this case, we're going to go a half inch. I'm going to leave that 0. We're going to go a half inch vertically. And we're going to hit copy. And now we have our 2 rows. And in this case, you can either, like I did before, if you hover over the corner of your bounding box, you can either flip it, like I did there. And I just held Shift and rotated so that it stayed in line. Or, which we've used before, not that, what we've used before in some of our transformation earlier in the semester. You can use your reflect tool, which basically just flips the image either vertically or horizontally instead of rotating it. There's going to be times where you use one over the other. Obviously, in this case, they're just solid squares, so rotating it doesn't change any orientation. But if you had any kind of like graphics that you didn't want to be upside down, essentially, you would use the reflect. So I'm just going to do the reflect vertically, hit OK, and then again here, now you can do your select all, and we can do another transform, move, and we're going to move this down 1 inch, and we're going to hit copy, and now we've created a copy of all of these. And then here we can do our repeat transformation, Command D twice, and we've created a super awesome checkerboard. I know that was like super, super riveting, but I wanted to just show you that move tool. I know we dealt with some transformations. I have to select something to actually show you. Like I know we've dealt with some of the basics, the rotate, reflect, scale, shear, etc. I believe we've dealt with the move tool, but I wanted to show you this in relation to creating a pattern. So this is a simple way to create a pattern. If you have a a specific artboard size that you're going to be using and that you're going to be filling with a pattern like this. But let's say we want to create, I went through all this, I'm looking at my notes. We want to create a repeating tiled pattern that you can use to fill objects. I had to find my mouse here. So this is actually part of one of our exercises that we're going to be working with today. So you can use just about any, I think any, but I'll say just about just in case, just about any objects to create a pattern. And creating a pattern and modifying patterns is relatively easy. When you get into a little bit more advanced pattern making, it can get a little bit tricky, and you'll see once we start doing it, optically it gets a little bit funky. So it can get kind of confusing at first, but once you kind of play with it and get the hang of it, it's relatively easy to create these things. So let's say we want to create this kind of like star pattern. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, just kind of like arbitrarily throw these stars. I always say I'm going to like randomly throw them in, and then I end up nitpicking and editing my quick demo here. So let's say we have this kind of super quick, relatively, see, and then this is what I do, I get too nitpicky, relatively quick, somewhat arbitrary pattern, star pattern or star design that we want to create a repeating pattern to. What you can do, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, there's a couple different things you can do, is we can go up to Object, and it always takes me a second to find it, Pattern, and Make, and you'll see once you hit Make, I don't know why my pop-ups here are showing on my other monitor, but you'll see when you hit Make Pattern, it automatically, and you can hide this so you don't see it, but it says a new pattern has been added to the swatches panel. Any changes while made in pattern mode will be applied to the swatch upon exit, which basically means any changes here will be reflected in the swatch panel. So once we're done here, it will automatically, or it already did, automatically added the pattern to our swatches panel to be used later. And you'll see here you get a lot of different options for your pattern. It will give you a preview of what the repeated pattern looks like. It'll show you the tile highlighted, and you can change this as well. Like you can dim your copies or choose to not dim your copies. Generally, I like to have the copies dimmed just so you can kind of see your original tile in comparison to the rest of the repeated pattern. But you'll see you have a lot of different options. You have the tile type by default. It just grids it, where it just repeats this pattern in a square grid. You can brick by row, which offsets it vertically or horizontally rather. You can brick by column. I jumped ahead of myself, which you can offset vertically. For this pattern, those two options don't really make a whole lot of sense because it doesn't really change it a ton. I mean, you see it changes it a little bit. It makes it a little bit more even than by grid. You see these stars are kind of squished together. You can size tile to art. In this case, our tile and our art piece is the same. It's 1 inch by 1 inch. You can select move tile with art. So as you move your, as you move your object, it's supposed to be moving the tile as well. And I'm not sure why it's not. There we go. So now when you move, if you wanted to center this on your document for some reason, it'll move your tile and the art together. Generally, personally, I leave this unchecked because I like to move the objects around within the tile, or if I'm moving, if I have something that's a little bit bigger than the tile that overlaps, I like to kind of be able to move my art within the tile. And then the different kind of overlaps, the left side in front or the right side in front. For a lot of patterns, I don't want to say that it's unnecessary or it wouldn't be there, but for a lot of basic patterns, for some of the patterns that we're going to be doing, this generally doesn't matter. It's just which side is going to, if you have objects that are on top, like which side is going to be on top. It's a little bit more important when you have more detailed repeated patterns. And again, the dim copies show tile edges, which I actually like having shown so you can actually see. It's a black tile, so you can't really see it too well, but so you actually see your tile edge. And show swatch bounds will show more of a bounding box. So you see any, as it said, any changes you make while you're in this tile edit mode, and you'll see you're in this pattern edit mode. It's a lot like when you hit isolation mode by accident, when I think it's like triple click on an object and you get into that isolation mode. In this case, it's really, really handy. You'll have this red line at the top and you'll have this sort of dim tile thing. Although I don't want to say there's not a command for it, but it's a lot harder to do that by accident than entering isolation mode, which I do all the time. You can create a new pattern with the isolated path. You can save a copy. You can just hit done if you want to just overwrite what you're doing, or you can hit cancel like anything else. So in this case, you have the option to sort of drag these around if you wanted to edit and sort of nitpick your tile design like I always do. And now you have sort of like a little bit more of an even we have a little bit more of an even pattern. So it allows you to sort of edit on the fly there. It allows us to sort of edit on the fly while saving our swatch. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hit done, and we have our new pattern in our swatches panel, which you can double click to get those pattern options again. You can name stars red. I'm going to hit done, and then now you'll see when you hover over, now it's got the name of the swatch or the pattern. So that's one way to create a swatch, or a pattern rather. Another way you can do it is, let's say we wanted this black square, but we wanted the stars white. I'm going to select the black square first, and then I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to drag and select, which will deselect the black square and select my red stars, and then I'm just going to change them to white. Now we could, in theory, if we double clicked our stars pattern, change the color, and then did save as a copy, it would save as a copy. Or I wanted to show you a different way to create patterns. What you can do is select your objects that you want to make a pattern, and you can just drag it to your swatches panel, and you'll see you get this little plus sign. And when you drop it, it automatically, when you have multiple objects together and you drag them into your swatches panel, it automatically knows that it's a pattern, and it creates a new pattern for you. And then you can edit it in the same way. You can edit it again. And again, we'll do it very quickly, but let's say we wanted blue stars. blue, and then we could do save as copy. Oh, it's going to make me name it again. I don't know why. Blue. Oh, it's because I already... It's making me... That's why. Okay. So that one, the original one was white. We changed it to blue. I think it said untitled before. So now we're going to save as copy. Stars. Blue. Hopefully. There we go. And then here we get our new pattern has been added. Ba, ba, ba. And then now we're going to hit done. And now you'll see we have our blue, our white, and I think I accidentally moved something, and our red. So once you have your objects as a pattern, you can delete all of that, and it's not going to delete. It's not going to delete your swatches because they're swatches, right? So it's kind of like when you create a color. If you're not using that color, it still remains in your swatch palette. So using the patterns can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So I'm just going to create a circle here, and I'm just going to fill it with our red stars. Now that's not too tricky, right? What gets somewhat tricky is, I don't know what the last command was here, so when you resize an object, good. When you resize an object, right, so I just held down shift to keep the circle the same, you'll see my object is changing. My circle is larger, and the pattern remains the same. It's just obviously filling the object more, but the scale of the pattern isn't changing at all. So I'm going to undo a couple times. Okay, there we go. I'll undo a couple times. You can change this if you want to. Let's say we wanted to make this circle smaller, and we wanted the here, I'll make a copy really quick. So let's say we wanted this circle to be a little bit smaller, but we wanted the pattern to scale with it as well. Under your scale tool here, if we double click our scale tool, and let's scale this down to 75%, and you'll see as we go from, actually I'll uncheck preview, as we go from 100 to 75, the object size changes but the pattern size doesn't. You can click this little checkbox where we have corners, stroke and effects, objects. You can also transform patterns if you choose to. So now you'll see as we click and uncheck this, check and uncheck this, you'll see the pattern also scales as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using patterns. It can be a pain. I should have brought one to show you, but so we'll hit OK here. But now you'll know you'll see the next time, since we had that checked, the next time even we use our, it's not really the scale tool, but even when we resize by holding shift this way, now you'll see since we had that checked the last time, it's sort of remembering that setting, so it's scaling the pattern inside the object. So if you don't want that to happen again, I'll undo a couple. There we go. So if you don't want that to happen again, you can simply go, and you don't have to do a scale. You can leave this at 100%. You can uncheck that transformation and just hit OK. Like obviously, if you scale this at 100%, it's not going to scale because it's 100%. But basically, you're just locking in that transform patterns or to not transform patterns. So in this case now, that pattern size doesn't change. So there's times that you want this setting. There's times that you'll want the pattern to not change, and there's times that you will. In one case, for a particular client that we were working with, they had this crazy like computer chip. I mean, it was a really awesome illustration, but they had this cool like computer chip illustration as part of their design for a booth that we were doing, and it was a pattern, and it was a really, really complicated pattern. But we had to make sure that whenever we were scaling, and especially since we were scaling, like these things were built at like, I don't know, whatever they were, like 16th scale or something like that, and we were printing them, I think it was like, one of them was like 80 feet by, like, there were these giant square hanging signs, whatever. So the side was like 40 to 80 feet or something like that. So these are massive. So when we're scaling these things up to full size to make our print file, we have to make sure, and we would do it at least once where we'd scale it and we'd have this like massive, you know, whatever, 40-foot print, and then this tiny, tiny little pattern just repeated throughout the whole thing. We would be like, we forget to change that to scale the pattern. So you want to, in that case, we want to make sure that we're scaling the pattern as well. So no matter how big or small, you know, when we're going from something that's like 8.5 by 11 to 40 feet by 40 feet, we want to make sure that those patterns are scaling as well. And then you can also expand patterns, which we'll get into later, which just makes for printing that format a lot easier. It basically transforms when you expand a pattern, it basically makes the pattern just simple vector objects again. So we went into a little bit about repeating patterns. So these are sort of like random repeating patterns. Now if you wanted, there we go. If you wanted a repeating pattern that was more of a tiled repeating pattern, it's a little bit trickier. It's not too bad, but so let's go to, we have this object that we want to make our pattern. What you want to do basically is, let's say we wanted this pattern, you want this blue tile, right, with our lighter blue center, and then our diamonds and circles we want at the edges, but we want it to look uniform. Instead of, like, this is pretty, like, let's say we wanted these corners here, or I might even do it with a more simple pattern, but here I'm gonna do it with a little bit more of a simple pattern. So if we wanted a pattern that essentially looked like this, right? Repeat. I know that's often ugly, but if you wanted this to repeat to where it had this polka dot kind of thing repeating through the entire thing, what you want to do is you want to make sure, instead of having your objects within your bounding box, actually let me undo a bunch. There we go. You want to make sure that they are about halfway off the tile, because that's where the pattern is going to repeat. So here's where you can have, you know, again, you can use your smart guides or something simple like this. You can use your smart guides and have it snap. Or you can use your move tools. So if we have, this is a 1 inch by 1 inch square. So we can select our circle here, and we can transform and move, and we want this to move. Oh, we want to make sure, I'm going to cancel this because I want it to move from the center. So we want it to move an inch horizontally, 0 vertically. And you see, since we're moving it from the center, it moved from the center out, and now it's going to be perfectly aligned with our square, and we're just going to hit copy. And you can do the same thing. I'm going to hold shift and select both of these circles here, and we're going to do a move again, except in this case we're going to move it down vertically 1 inch, and then we're going to hit a copy. And then you can do the same thing for these guys. And again, you can use, in this case, I will move. You can see it snaps with your smart guides, again with a relatively simple pattern. I'm going to do a copy and paste in front. and then I'm just going to hold shift and rotate those guys. Oops, I copied everything. Ah, there we go. Right? Yes, okay. Rotate, there we go. So here is where we have our repeatable pattern, right? So we have basically what's going to end up repeating is pretty much just this corner, right? The book also gets us into using your Pathfinder. You can use your Pathfinder as well to sort of tighten these up a bit. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't personally. It just depends on the pattern. In this case, I wouldn't be too worried about it, but here they have, we're going to do our divide so it cuts anywhere there's an overlap. And then with our direct selection tool, our white arrow, we're just going to select everything that is outside of our blue square here and delete it. So now there's no chance that, you know, anything outside of the box will be off and mess up your pattern. So again, there's a couple different ways you can create this pattern. You can select your objects, drag them to your swatches palette, and now you have your new pattern swatch. And as we zoom out, you can see we have a nice repeatable pattern. As we go to 100%, it repeats seamlessly. And again, we have all of our options. You can change colors, you can save as, you can overwrite stuff. That was very technical. You can overwrite things, you can change colors again. Within your pattern options, you can name it. Here, I'm just going to leave this as blank. So I'm going to hit done. Oops. I meant to hit exit because I did move something. Another way you can also overwrite a pattern instead of going into your patterns and changing a color and hitting done, which honestly I find the sort of simplest way if you're gonna overwrite something. Let's say we wanted to select this middle. Now it's sort of an X, but this darker blue, and we want to make it white. We're going to hit done. And now we have our white pattern here instead of, let's get rid of that. Actually, I'm going to move this over to our free space. So now you'll see we have our white pattern here. And any changes you'll make, somewhat lastly, any changes you make to your patterns, whether it's in the pattern options or overwriting, which I'll show you in a second, will reflect in any pattern that's being used. So let's say we wanted to make this red, and we're going to hit done. Now you'll see, since this is in use, that's pretty obnoxious. Since this is in use and you change the swatch, it'll automatically reflect that change that you just made. I'm going to go back. Another way you can do that is, so this is our vector object that doesn't affect the pattern until we make it a pattern, right? So let's say we wanted to have, we wanted to overwrite this. Let's make it a gray. So instead of just dragging and dropping and creating a new swatch, you can hold Option, and you'll see that plus changes slightly. Oops, as it didn't do it. It should be changing that pattern, unless I'm doing the wrong which I'm probably doing the wrong, there we go. It's very easy to miss as well. So you'll see as we're, there we go. So as I'm hovering over, let me show you, let me magnify a little bit. This is where the sort of somewhat trickiness of this happens a lot. It's super easy to miss, as you'll see here. That little highlight is popping to the left and to the right of the swatch, which means it's just going to create a new swatch to the left or the right. And as we're holding Option, again, it's very easy to miss that tile. You want to make sure, there you go. You want to make sure that that outline is around the tile. And as we drop it onto the tile, now we've actually changed and overwritten that. We've overwritten that pattern by dragging and dropping. This is the one case where I find it easier to go into the pattern options and change it as you want to. Let's say we want to make this a different color. And then I'm going to hit done if you want to overwrite it. And now we've hit done, and now it's green instead of the blue or white or whatever. I find it easier, if you're going to overwrite a pattern, just to get into double click and get into those pattern options, just because, again, it's super, super easy to miss. Let's go back a couple steps. It's super easy to miss, I feel, when you're trying to grab this and hold Option as I do it right the first time. I just feel like it's super easy to miss that. So I go into the pattern options. But again, once you guys start working and develop your own habits, you'll sort of find what works best for you. So that's a sort of quick and easy way to overwrite a pattern and to make changes to a pattern. And again, you could always, let's go back. If you didn't want to overwrite it, you can just drag it to your palettes, and now you have the green and the gray as different patterns. I generally tend not to overwrite patterns just because I like to have the original just in case I want to go back to it for any other reason. And you can use just about anything to create patterns. You can use shapes. You can use text, which we're going to use in one of our assignments. Any element that's within that that tile, any element that's within that tile or that you use to create, I was just going to show you sort of arbitrarily. Sort of one of the other assignments. Part of one of the other assignments is creating this sort of pattern with a letter and a couple shapes. So if we wanted to make this a pattern make, and you'll see we have our options here. So even with text, again, if we wanted this, let's make this pattern a little bit bigger, a 2-inch by 2-inch tile, and then you can sort of mess around. Oops. Let's not move the tile with the art. You can kind of mess around with this. And create relatively interesting patterns. And this is essentially what you're going to be doing for one of the assignments. Is creating this sort of, I don't know, I feel like it looks like kind of like a knockoff designer brand pattern, but you get the idea. Anything that fits within that tile, whether it's any element on your artboard, it can be, again, it can be text, it can be images, it can be vector objects, obviously. You can create relatively interesting, repeatable patterns that can be used to fill just about any object